Hey there, guys. Brian here. Just a reminder that you can now support The Other 51. If you go to patreon.com/theother51, you can find out information there on how to make a donation or become a subscriber. Again, that's patreon.com/theother51. Thanks. Now on with the show. Every writer knows that the best conversations about writing don't happen in classrooms or symposia or any other fancy artisanal setting. They happen at the bar, usually after deadline. That's the vibe we're going for here. This is The Other 51, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Brian Moritz. Today's guest is Kevin Blackistone. Kevin Blackistone, welcome to The Other 51. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for the invitation.
This is good. We are still in Bloomington. We had a good, fun night with cookies last night.
That was a great night. Anytime you can get cookies at 4 o'clock in the morning, although we were not out that late.
No.
But that was pretty unique.
Yeah, that was a baked Bloomington. I think we can give a shout out to.
Yeah,
that was good. So what did you end up having? I forget what kind of cookies you had.
I had chocolate with chocolate chips and walnuts.
All right,
it was great.
Yeah, I did chocolate with pretzel, which is very good.
That's
very
interesting.
Mix. Yeah. So we are still here at the 11th Summit of Communication in Sport. We want to give a shout out to Dr. Galen Clavio and the Media School here for hosting me in their podcast studio here, and we just had a great panel that you were a part of. Sports 2020, kind of looking ahead at the future of sports media. And I know the conversation that we had in the room kind of steered toward esports a little bit.
Right.
But I wanted to kind of start off talking about some of the other things. And you mentioned in one of your comments about how the way that we cover sports isn't real. You don't really see that changing kind of from a journalistic standpoint as we go into the next decade. I just want to know if you could kind of expand on that. And
I think the science of covering, of finding stories, reporting stories, and writing stories is pretty much set. I mean, we know the information that we want to glean from an event that we're at and from the participants in that event, and how we want to disseminate it to the public. So whether it's a baseball game or an esport game, I really don't think that's going to change. And if there's a personal interest story that we can find, then we're going to deliver that as well.
I think one of the other interesting things I thought you said was that about ESPN, and that they're moving. I've never heard it put this way, but it was really interesting. They're moving from being a TV company to a screen company.
Yeah, I mean that's the way I see it, because they've been watching their numbers decline in terms of subscribers, which has not so much to do with them, but has to do with the industry as a whole. And their investment right now is in streaming and getting things to people on whatever instrument they're going to use to watch ESPN programming. And so much of that is on our telephones or on our tablets or maybe on our computers, and still for very many of us on television. But they just can't focus anymore on just producing for television.
Right. And as someone who has their hands in a lot of pots, you teach, you're on TV, you write. From your perspective, I mean, what's the biggest challenge you think is sports media? I know that's a huge umbrella term, which is part of the problem, but what's the biggest challenge we're facing as an industry, do you think, in the next 10 years?
The biggest, for people who work in the industry, it is maintaining the job that they have or finding one if they lose the one that they don't have. That's the biggest challenge, and it's not made any easier by predatory investors in media who don't have media in their best interest. So, the Jeff Bezos are fewer than one would wish in media, where he's an owner of the Washington Post who has invested in human capital and gets paid incredible dividends for the Washington Post. But that, I think that's one of the biggest issues, because you need people to capture stories and deliver them in whatever form to whatever consumer you're going to have. So that's one huge challenge. And I think the other challenge is just being nimble with all of the technological changes in digital media, and finding out which new tool out there is going to be one that can actually help you and can attract the public's or potential consumers' interest. We talked today a lot about Twitch. I don't think we were talking about Twitch maybe a year and a half ago, but that is something that people have found some positive use for. But who knows? In 18 months, we may not be talking about Switch. It's probably going to be something else. So, being quick to find out how to use these new applications, I think that's another big challenge.
Yeah, it's one of those things I kind of struggle with in teaching my own classes, is like that sweet spot of trying to figure out, like, trying something new, but is this going to last? And, like, kind of investing time in, like, teaching a platform versus kind of, like, bigger skills, like around storytelling and stuff like that you kind of can adapt to a platform here or there. And I struggle with that.
Yeah, I don't think you can really teach a platform.
Okay.
Right? I mean, I think you can teach the idea of being a risk taker, the idea of if you're a manager, not being fearful of letting reporters or producers, as so many are called now, being able to use the latest tool that's out there to see if it's going to work. So, I think you encourage innovation, but you teach those basic skills that are not going to change over time.
So we've been talking about the future. I kind of want to spin back to the past a little bit. I had Brian Curtis, who was your fellow panelist today, had him on the podcast last week, and he mentioned that when he was growing up, he grew up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Right. One of the people he used to read was you. He used to see your mugshot.
I have matured, yes.
And so that was, we can talk about that sports staff, because that was just, one of the all-time great sports staffs. But I'm wondering, who is that person? Who are those people for you that you grew up reading and kind of inspired you to do this?
Well, not necessarily the people you would think, because my intent was not to be a sports writer. I was a Watergate baby, and when I went to college, I went with the idea of learning how to become as good a news reporter as I could, so that I could bring down, the next presidency, right? So I wasn't thinking about sports. I mean, I did grow up in Washington, D.C., and saw 3 newspapers, the Washington Post, which is still around, and which had Shirley Povich, the Washington Star, which had Mo Siegel, I believe, and the Washington Daily News, which was a tabloid newspaper, a tab for a time. It was short-lived, and I forget who was writing there. But for me, it was more really other people that I grew up reading, like Bill Raspberry in the Washington Post, who wrote on race and politics and culture and things going on in Washington, D.C. By the time I got to college, I'm reading people like one sports columnist was John Schulian in the Chicago Sun-Times. But I didn't really I can't say that I had, one person. I mean, I used to read Sam Lacey in the Baltimore Afro-American, who's legendary because of his advocacy for Jackie Robinson or some other black player to break the color barrier in baseball. So I didn't really have, any one particular person, but I will say that as I began to grow as a professional journalist, and then when I got the opportunity to start writing a column, then there were some people I started to focus in on. But again, they weren't necessarily sports writers. Like I was going back and reading reading H.L. Mencken, who I still think, despite the fact that he may have been racist, misogynistic, and anti-Semitic, all of those horrible things, he was one hell of a column writer. Maybe the greatest we've ever seen. So I read a lot of people who were writing columns that were not necessarily about sports.
And how'd that influence your sports writing?
Well, I have to back up a little bit. So my interest in news was really what they would call now social justice. And the first place I worked in earnest was a place called the Chicago Reporter as a senior at Northwestern. And the Chicago Reporter was and is dedicated to covering social and racial issues in and around Chicago. And after a brief stint after my graduation at the Boston Globe, where I covered a lot of racially motivated assaults and murders, I was able to come back to the Chicago Reporter and work for another couple, 3 years, whatever it was up there. And so I really sink my teeth into covering those types of issues in Chicago. So that's always been my interest. So when I started writing a sports column in 1990 or whatever it was, 91 or something like that, one of the things I wanted to do was bring that lens to sports. And I remember the first column I ever wrote was about the two black owners who had acquired a stake in the Denver Nuggets, and they had fired the coach at the time, and the coach turned around and filed a discrimination lawsuit against them. And I remember writing this column about how outrageous and frivolous the lawsuit was, given the fact that if anybody was going to file a lawsuit for discrimination within the NBA, it should be hopeful black coaches who never got a shot for whatever reasons of being a head coach in the NBA. And shortly thereafter, not necessarily because of what I wrote, but the case was thrown out of court, or either I think it was thrown out of court, or either the guy who filed it withdrew it on his own because it had no merit. So that's the lens that I brought is something that's I've been developing for years.
How was that received? Because you were writing this back in 1990, 1991. I mean, that's a very much a different era, definitely of sports writing and sports media.
Yeah, there were only I think at the time that I was I became a sports columnist. There were only four others in the country, four other black sports columnists in the country, out of about 1,500 daily newspapers at the time. Bill Rhoden was at the New York Times. My friend Mike Wilbon was at the Post. Brian Burwell, I believe, was in Detroit or at USA Today. And there was somebody somewhere else who I'm forgetting right now. So, and we would write about these sorts of things, and in part because we felt a need to do it because nobody else was, because they were ignored, because there was a long-standing kind of ethos in sports reporting that you kept at arm's length serious issues like that from the sports pages. And part of it was because in the 1920s, when there were all the newspaper wars going on, from heavy political reporting, newspaper owners learned that they could keep and hold subscribers and buyers with sports news that was not politicized, and so that's how sports became known as the toy department. And but for us, race and culture in sports was no game. Mm-hmm. It was a very real issue.
And you mentioned a few times the symbiotic relationship between sports and sports media, and I think I use that exact wording in like every paper I write. Because it's absolutely, and the historical context I think is important because that was like the safe zone for newspapers.
Absolutely, a very huge safe zone, and the relationship between sports and sports media goes back to the 19th century and how sports journalists like Chadwick, who was arguably the first sports journalist, created all the analytics, the early analytics for baseball that we know of now, batting average and that sort of thing that baseball embraced because it was a new way of delivering their product in a very digestible way to the public, making their sport more interesting, and which meant more people would buy tickets and more people would listen to games on radio and eventually on television, and that's just continued all the way along. And so now we see these gazillion-dollar rights fees contracts between broadcasters and the sports we love to watch, and they will go out of their way to look the other direction when there is information that might turn off their public. I mean, this is what we've seen in the entire demonstration by NFL players against police lethality against unarmed black men in this country. Mm-hmm. That the league is the league of all white owners, with a labor force that is more than 2/3 black male, are at odds over this issue, and that's problematic. But they're thinking about their audience, they're thinking about advertisers, they're thinking about all that.
Do you find that writing about issues like that, is there a difference in how it's received by maybe just other journalists, but definitely the public now than it was back when you started doing it?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
There's no question. I mean, it's the tide has changed greatly. I mean, I was amazed to see the number of people just in the media on Twitter the other day, other sports writers in particular, on the media the other day, absolutely aghast that the NFL would play the national anthem to kick off the NFL draft, which most people did not think that they had ever seen that before.
With like a full military color guard on stage.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody does militarization and package patriotism better than the NFL. But now people recognize how problematic that is. Years ago when I first wrote about it at the Dallas Morning News, I'll never forget. I came in the next morning, and on our billboard, my sports editor had tacked up a number of pink slips, which were notes from of phone calls into the newspaper, people canceling their subscription,
really, because
they were upset that I questioned the place of the national anthem to start off sports contests. And then when I talked about it on air a few years ago, during Around the Horn, I can't remember what prompted the conversation, but the University of Maryland was inundated with some calls and letters from people I will just characterize as in the right wing of politics in this country, calling for them to fire me remember the president's secretary called me to find out what it was all about, and I explained it, and then my dean graciously issued a statement in support of me and my learned position on this particular issue. And now plenty of people have written and spoken about the appropriateness of the national anthem in sports from a lot of different angles. So, yeah, I mean, things have changed dramatically just in the past few years.
I know your writing and your work, even back as a news reporter, you were always interested in kind of like journalism as advocacy.
Yeah.
So advocacy.
Right.
Where'd that idea come from for you?
Being a black man in America. I mean that's the root of it. When I was in high school, I remember one of my final papers in my senior year was a paper on the use of civil disobedience by black folk in America. And when I was in grad school, my original thesis was on the use of pamphlets by black writers in the 19th century, which led up to Ida B. Wells doing the work that she did as a journalist and chronicling the plague of lynching in this country, which she was very methodic in pulling together as a solid piece of journalism, as well as a solid piece of journalism that advocated for laws against lynching to stop this horrific practice. So, for me, good journalism can certainly be or is advocacy journalism because we are trying to check the power structure. We're trying to change laws that are not just when we point out reasons why. Maybe try to come up with laws that are justified. And I think that's an important part of journalism. So that's why, that's the root of my advocacy in journalism.
Well, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, any journalism is advocacy. Like if you're
so.
Woodward and Bernstein were doing advocacy.
Sure.
It's not in it's kind of like a code that when you talk about using advocacy journalism, it's
right.
Usually,
People think when you say advocacy journalism, that's politicized journalism.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily have to be politicized, but it's trying to stand up for what's right and trying to point out what's wrong. And I don't think there's any problem with that at all. And as a columnist, I have far more leeway. Right. I don't have to shy away from being an advocate.
Right. So kind of switch gears a little here, but I'm wondering what it was like at the Dallas in the Dallas media environment back when you were working there and at that paper. So it is one of the great sports sections of all time. So
we had a great run. Yeah. It was fantastic. Number one, it was a great staff. It was considered for a long time the best sports staff or sports page in the country because we'd win these Triple Crown awards, which the APSE, Associated Press Sports Editors, would hand out every year. And it was great because we had a lot of money, so we could you could. It was not unusual for you to be at one thing in one part of the country and then get a call from the desk, hey, before you come home, can you go to another part of the country and cover something? Right. I remember in 1998, I walked into the sports editor's office, Dave Smith, going into the it was late spring, early summer, and I told him I was bored, and what I wanted to do was I wanted to go to Europe and cover 3 sports that were happening on consecutive weekends. It was the Wimbledon finals were one weekend, the British Open was another weekend, and Lance Armstrong was going to be making his his real debut in the Tour de France. And maybe I could do that for him. And he was from Dallas.
Mm-hmm.
And so Dave didn't even look up from his desk. He was like, go. So I went. And the only thing that fell apart was Lance got sick.
Okay.
And could not compete. But I hung out with the U.S. Postal team for like a week and, wrote about that. So, yeah, it was great. And now, people can't even go to their Final Four, even if it's in the state in which they work at their paper, because the paper can't afford it or doesn't want to spend the money. So it was a great time.
That's almost unfathomable these days to think about that.
Oh my goodness, yeah, and that's just one time that it happened.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and there used to be there was also a big newspaper war between the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Dallas Morning News, and L.A. Times. Their editors, Amder at New York Times, George Solomon, who I work for now at the Shirley Povich Center for Sports Journalism, was at the Washington Post, and Bill, why am I blanking on Bill's name? Who was the editor of the L.A. Times? They would all try and one-up each other covering big events, right? Mm-hmm. Particularly the Olympics. If someone heard that the Washington Post was sending 20 people to the Olympics, then they would try and send 21, and then the other paper would try and send 22. I mean, it was absurd. But yeah, I mean, I can remember we would staff every March Madness game.
Every one?
Every one.
That's crazy.
Every game we had a writer at. You would never read. We never ran anything from AP or any other wire service during March Madness.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
What's the most memorable or your favorite event that you've covered?
Well, one of the most memorable certainly is the Mike Tyson bite fight.
Okay.
So I remember, there was nothing more exciting in the 90s than a Mike Tyson fight.
Right.
Man, just nothing. It was unbelievable. And I remember there's a stoppage in the fight, and we're all looking around, and there's all this, I think it's the MGM Grand. I mean, it's just, there's a din, and you're trying to figure out what's happening, and someone said he bit his ear. And I remember we just all looked at each other incredulously. That couldn't have happened. And then 5 seconds later, on the big screen, they show it. And I was just like, I can't believe that just happened. So certainly, if that happened, you know what the next move is going to be. They're going to cancel. They're going to stop the fight. No, they continue on, and then he does it again. It's just like unbelievable. So then they stop the fight, and I remember running to the press room, and those were during the times when we would write a pre-column, which you hoped would kind of would hold its place with very little editing needed to file right after the game and right after the fight. And so, because it would go so late. And in this case, it had to be blown up. I mean, because how can you anticipate this kind of an ending, right? And I remember I had a problem sending after I rewrote this column. And so I packed up my bag and took out of the press room and made it upstairs to the casino, and it was just a sea of commotion in the casino, and I'm pushing through people and trying to get to the elevator so I can get up and file my rewritten column, and I get up there and I plug in, I send it, and I call the desk to make sure they got it, and they go, yeah, we got it, but it's too late.
Oh.
It was like, a couple minutes too late. So that was just a gut punch. And then I want to say, after that, I went downstairs back to the casino to drown my sorrows, and all hell broke loose in the casino. I think this was the same night. I'm pretty sure. And someone thought there had been shots fired in the casino. So the gendarmes come in. They lock all the doors. They're not letting people in. If you're in and you didn't have a room key, they were kicking you out. It was just unbelievable. I mean, people ducked under tables. Chips were flying. It was just it was just the most chaotic thing ever. And the MGM Grand, I believe, was closed down for a couple, 3 hours that morning, until everything got settled down. So that was that was very memorable.
Do you remember what the pre-written column was, or your pre-deadline column was?
I don't remember, but I'm sure. Well, I'm not sure, but it was probably something along the lines of kind of suggesting that Mike Tyson had won this fight.
Okay.
All right. It was something. It's not. You kind of had to straddle this line, and it was kind of a placeholder in the paper, but it would wind up being in the first couple editions because. Of the Sunday paper, just because that's what they had to do in those days, and but the good thing is my column that I did pull together that night held up very well for the Monday newspaper, and I remember our editorial page even excerpted part of it and into an editorial, and it got picked up a lot of places. So I was able to salvage something, but that was just a crazy night. Crazy night.
So what's the best thing you've read lately?
I was really, really proud of a piece a former student of mine wrote who's at the Undefeated. Her name is Rhiannon Walker. And she wrote a piece last week that was an analytical piece on the lack of black managers in Major League Baseball. And she tied it all back to Jackie Robinson, who just before he died gave a speech in which he chastised baseball for not giving black men an opportunity to manage. And her whole point was all these years later we're celebrating Jackie Robinson, and still nobody listened to his words. Mm-hmm. They used him as a symbol of progress, but in fact his words, which have rung so hollow over the years, are proof that baseball hasn't progressed. And her piece was irrefutable in terms of how she used numbers to show that baseball has been proactive in discriminating against men of color when it comes to getting managerial jobs.
Yeah, I always use Jackie Robinson as when we talk about the stick to sports stuff in my sports writing class. It's the, what April 15th, what's everyone wear? 42. Why do they wear it? Jackie Robinson. Why? Da-da-da-da. You can't celebrate Jackie Robinson and then tell people to stick to sports. It's completely an intellectually dishonest argument.
It is. And also, even the celebration of Jackie Robinson is in itself disingenuous in the way that it's done on the part of baseball, because they've used it to whitewash 3 generations in which they had maintained segregation in what was America's pastime. Mm-hmm. And so, they never talk about the past. And it's amazing that they've been able to turn this tragedy into a celebration, and where they pat themselves on the back for letting one black man play baseball.
Right. Kevin, this has been wonderful. I know you've got places to be here at the conference, but I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, it's a good conversation.
All right, appreciate it.
Cool.
As always, thanks for listening to The Other 51. You can find show notes for this episode and all our episodes at sportsmediaguy.com on the Other 51 tab. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. I can highly recommend Overcast for this. Our theme music is by Ellie Moritz.